Communities. 1. The sense of the concrete. It is still popularly supposed that communities that communicate with mythical categories are dominated by imagination, whereas modern scientific communities are dominated by exacting empirical observation. In fact, the communities that have survived in difficult or extremely complex environments, such as tropical rainforests, teeming with predators and also with venomous serpents, spiders, and ants, and with thousands of plant species, most of which have evolved toxins to avoid being eaten by animals, could have survived only if they observed the environment minutely and exactly and communicated that knowledge to their children.
Claude Lévi-Strauss cites many examples. The Hopi of North America, who identify and name 350 species of plants. The Navajo, 500 species. The Sunan of the southern Philippines identify and name 8,000 species of plants. Since most of these are neither edible nor poisonous, it is an intellectual curiosity and not practical need that drives this empirical observation. In addition, plants, animals, and material features are classified according to their visible and audible properties. The properties of material and of living things are put in relationship. Coexistence and causality are observed and recorded in memory. The classifications and relations are concrete, perceivable. Lévi-Strauss affirms that this intellectual drive was responsible for the great arts that gave rise to civilization in the Neolithic age: pottery, weaving, agriculture, and the domestication of animals. The Neolithic Revolution began some 12,500 years ago. The scientific revolution of 16th and 17th century Europe is certainly not the beginning of a knowledge based on empirical observation or intellectual elaboration of classifications and relationships. Instead, what are new are the objects that this intellectual work dealt with. In modern science, these objects are often not perceived or perceivable. Physics does not work with colors, but with the frequencies of light. Lévi-Strauss called the knowledge that characterized human communities since the Neolithic age a science of the concrete, and modern science a science of the abstract. Myths are intellectual constructions that deal with the origin of the cosmos, of the furnishing and inhabitants of the earth, of a people, of laws. Mythical thinking works on these issues not with abstract concepts such as being or first cause or energy or electromagnetism, but with concrete terms, which Lévi-Strauss compares with schemas in Immanuel Kant or signs in Fernando Saussure's linguistics. Concrete categories, such as a male and female, up and down, raw and cooked, boiled and broiled, fresh and decayed, honey and ashes, and so on. However, the intellectual methods, the logical operations, the forms of reason are the same in myth and in modern sciences, in the science of the concrete and the science of the abstract. Everywhere, the intellect establishes contrasts, oppositions, relations of contiguity and succession. Understanding works by establishing relationships, classifications, making transpositions, reversals. In the 4 volumes of his Mythologie, Lévi-Strauss demonstrated the often extremely complex reasonings at work in myths. 2. The mythic communion. The modern philosophical understanding of myth was elaborated in the 19th century by Friedrich Schelling, Friedrich Schlegel, Johann Gottfried Herder, Johann Jakob Bachhofen, Rudolf Otto, and their successors, thinkers called the Romantics. Myth tells of the origin of the world, the origin of the people. It tells of the origin of laws, institutions, and rituals. It tells of destiny, of gods, and of humans. These thinkers conceived myth as a primordial logos that first articulates the world. The primary language does not narrate are known and visible. Instead, it discloses what it names, invokes it, makes it present. Myth is the primordial language that first articulates, extends, and reveals the forces and the powers, the dimensions of space, the gods, the origins of the people, and the direction of time. A myth names and invokes a people, gods, heroes, powerful animals, mystical landscapes, and trees. The mythic language is called forth by reality, and reality becomes present and remains present in the primordial language. These names and categories will be taken up in everyday speech and also in the speech of priests and rulers. A myth is told by named and nameless narrators, generation after generation. It is the speech that is common to a people, the speech in and by which people communicate, come together. A multitude are brought together, recognize themselves as one people by telling the myth. The myth articulates visions, relations, and interactions that are shared and that govern cooperation and enterprises. It engenders the community. A myth is told and retold. It is also enacted in ritual, which reenacts the origin of the cosmos, the gods, and the people, and reenacts the great events told in the myth. The myth engenders priests and sages who tell the myth, and engenders a political order and practices of production and exchange. The account elaborated by these thinkers make us recognize the force, the efficacy of myth. It shows the originating forces of the people, of language, of institutions. More strongly, these thinkers, Schelling, Schlegel, Herder, Bachmann, and Otto, declare that myth depicts and engenders communion. People have an identity in and are identified with the identity of the community. Each person sees the others as like himself or herself, with shared language, shared history, shared gods, sees himself or herself in the others. He sees himself in the leader, and the leader immanent in him. He sees himself in the community, and the community in him. The community is a living body, of which the people are its members. Those who die for the community, for the defense or growth of the community, live on in the community, live on in the life of the community. More broadly, the myth engenders and depicts communion of humans with the dead, with ancestors, with nature, with tokemen or guardian animals, and with gods. And communion with themselves. In and through the myth, people have an identity. Their identity is recognized by others and by themselves. The Romantics worked out the nature and function of myth at a time when they recognized that the age of myth had come to an end in the West. The Greek, Roman, Norse, and Celtic myths that they studied had come to an end. Everyone could see the Christian myth progressively losing force. The Romantics observed most painfully the loss of community in the modern world, where politics served material production and technological manipulation. Individuals are identified and identify themselves only as units of production and consumption. These thinkers called for a restoration of community, and therefore for the renewal and recreation of myth. Renewal and recreation of myth by art, poetry, and the creative imagination. Richard Wagner set out with Gesamtkunstwerk, assembling of all the arts, to renew the ancient Teutonic myths for post-Christian Europe. The most powerful and most effective project to create communion, to create a people, by creating a myth, was that laid out by Adolf Hitler's My Struggle and Adolf Rosenberg's The Myth of the 20th Century. They envisioned a folk, a people one with a nation, a communion in blood and land, in communion with a leader. The community, the nation, gives birth to the citizen. The citizen lives in and with the life of the nation. The highest affirmation and destiny of a person is heroism, where someone sacrifices himself or herself for the defense and growth of the nation. The hero who dies for the community henceforth lives in the life of the nation. The total community that National Socialism set out to build required recreating ancient Aryan myths. Generations of citizens and militants, of workers and servants of the states, have imagined their deaths reabsorbed or sublated in the community. Jean-Luc Nancy observes in his book, The Inoperative Community. The notion, contained in the myth of communion, that those who die for the community, for the defense or growth of the community, live on in the community, live on in the life of the community. This notion, Nancy declares, is not true. Death is a limit and the annihilation of a singular being. It is not true that the dead are transfigured into some substance or subject, be these homeland, native blood or soil, nation, a delivered or fulfilled humanity, absolute philanthropy, family, or mystical body, he writes. This is not to say that it is meaningless for people to go to death willingly in an effort to rescue others, or to resist and try to overthrow oppressors, or to go to death willingly in a struggle to destroy oppressive institutions and to establish just institutions. Millions of deaths, of course, are justified by the revolt of those who die. They are justified as a rejoinder to the intolerable, as insurrections against the social, political, technical, military, religious oppression. But these deaths are not sublated. Their death is a limit of their singular existence. Their singular lives do not live on in the life of the social body. Nancy declares peremptorily, we no longer have anything to do with myth. I would be tempted to say that we no longer have even the right to speak about it, to be interested in it. 3. The rational community. In Germany, as the Nazi myth was being created and taking hold, Edmund Husserl, in his book, The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, reflected on the origin and nature of philosophy. In the commercial port of Athens, foreigners arrive asking the questions foreigners ask. Why do you speak as you do as you do? In every mythic community, the answers always are, because our ancestors have said this, have taught us to do this, because our gods have declared this, have ordered us to do this. In Athens, men who came to be called philosophers answered differently. They offered reasons that the foreigner who does not have the ancestors and the gods of Athens could accept, that just anyone endowed with insight could accept. Socrates, in Plato's writings, emerged not as the founder of a new body of information and beliefs, but as the founder of this practice. The Socratic or philosophical practice is the commitment to hold in suspense each belief one has acquired from what is said in one's community, and which one has derived from one's own experience, until one can formulate the reason and the justification for it. A reason and a justification that one presents to the other for his acceptance or rejection. It is to envision the other, any other, as endowed with insight. For the other must not accept or reject what the philosopher says by invoking authority, the authority of ancestors or gods, but must offer reasons for his acceptance or rejections. Reasons that the philosopher, reasons that just anyone endowed with insight can accept. A philosopher is not a sage who accedes to insights beyond the reach of ordinary people. A philosopher envisions a community of people endowed with insight, a rational community. And by his practice, the philosopher inaugurates this community. Tribes and nations give place to humanity, one humanity, through rational practice. The philosophical practice founds scientific practice. In ancient times founds mathematics and logic, which will one day be united into mathematical logic. And in modern times founds empirical sciences. Empirical science is simple observations that count as observations only if they are repeatable, verifiable by anyone with insight and the requisite equipment. What a scientist states is derived from the body of observations explained by laws and theories. A scientist speaks as a representative of science. A logician says about this problem what any logician anywhere says. A veterinarian conveys what veterinary science has observed and understood about the ailment your dog is suffering. A chemist says what any trained and knowledgeable chemist anywhere says. The rational community, invoked and inaugurated by rational practice, forms as humans submit what they observe and believe to questioning, to contestation by others, by just anyone endowed with insight. The rational community is in principle coextensive with humanity. Four, the ontological community. For us, myth has been interrupted, Jean-Luc Nancy says, by literature. In novels, the writing lays out, reveals a world, names, invokes, calls forth, makes present the dimensions of space, the forces and the powers, the people, cities, and forests, the dimensions of time. The narrative that a literary author writes, the world that he or she reveals, is not legitimated by a discourse that has perceived and verified that world, nor is it legitimated by narratives that have told and tell this narrative. A novel is not authorized or legitimated. An author has no authority. An author does not speak for the community. His or her voice is not the voice of the community. An author does not program the work of a community, does not compose the politics. An author writes for the others, exposes himself or herself to others. An author reveals himself in his singularity, not by presenting himself as the hero of his narrative, but by the singularity of his writing. He or she presents others other than himself. Emily Bronte writes of a man, Heathcliff. Tolstoy writes of a woman, Anna Karenina. If the narrative speaks in the work, he appears as a character in the narrative, a character in a work of fiction. Myths present heroes. Odysseus, Shiva, King Solomon are exemplary by filling out completely a certain virtue or a certain action. We identify with them because they are models, exemplars. In novels, the character that is presented is a singular being. He or she is not completely exemplary, remains incomplete, such that one cannot simply identify with him or her. Don Quixote and Dr. Aziz in Forster's Passage to India are not heroes like Marduk, Achilles, or Girate and Castitas. They are not completely identified with a certain virtue or a certain action. In novels, people are not merged and prolonged in a community of communion. Their birth interrupts the common understanding and works of the community. Their lives are interrupted and annihilated by death. In novels, people are exposed to others, perceived by others, affected by, acted on by others. A novel shows a certain number of people to whom a person is exposed. This constellation of others does not form an organization or an organism. It is simply a constellation of people exposed to one another. We can add by novels, we are not speaking only of books. Everything we say of novels applies also to cinema, to works such as Hiroshima Mon Amour, Woman in the Dunes, Ashes and Diamonds, and Fargo. In novels, Jean-Luc Nancy says, to be born is to be a singular being, not simply the effect of causes or something produced by parents or by the community. A person does not have and find his or her identity in a leader, hero, exemplar, nor in the body or the soul of the community. The other is not a copy or variant of me. I do not perceive myself in him or her. He or she is singular. For this singular being to be born is to be from the start exposed to death. Death is the annihilation of this singular being. He or she is not absorbed into, integrated into the social body that lives on. His or her works survive him or her, to be sure, but this singular person is annihilated. We do not know that by observing our death as though from above. Instead, we discover that in being exposed to the deaths of others. When I am exposed to the death of someone, a singular being has been annihilated and will not be restored or replaced. And whenever I have a premonition that the others about me are vulnerable, mortal, they are exposed to me in their singularity. A person is a singular being, but essentially exposed to others, presented to or offered to others. This situation of being exposed to one another is, Nancy says, our fundamental ontological situation, the fundamental community. It is more fundamental than the community conceived as communion, union of members in the living body of a community. It is more fundamental than the society constructed by coordination of tasks and exchange of goods and services. In being visible to others, being audible to others, we communicate. We expose our singular shape and posture, our singular gestures and utterances. We expose our muscled stance or obese awkwardness, the graceful moves of our hands, or the rigidity of our grimaces, our laughter and our tears. To speak is to expose oneself to others. This communication is more fundamental than communication conceived as the exchange of messages of general words and concepts. This fundamental or ontological community does not only comprise humans, it also, Nancy says, comprises non-human animals, the inhuman and the superhuman, to which we are exposed. Their singularity is revealed in their vulnerability, their mortality. When someone who has sadistically tortured and murdered someone appears in our midst, we stand back in horror and view him or her as inhuman, a monster. We envision the essence, the general category. But when he or she has been captured and we learn more and more about him or her, his or her childhood, adolescence, sexual awakening, experiences in the army or with drugs, the category appears more and more vacuous, and a singular person appears exposed to us in all his or her remoteness. Similarly, what difference there is between envisioning the superhuman as God the Father, that is in our own image and likeness, and finding ourselves exposed to a superhuman power ungraspable and uncomprehendable. To deal with animals as poultry and beef cattle is to withdraw from community with them. To encounter them in their vulnerability and mortality is to find ourselves exposed to them in their singular being. A 15-year-old cat that is ailing, a fawn hit by a car, or a wounded street pigeon that we take to a veterinarian. Five, community in music. As myth loses its force, comes to an end in Europe, it gives way, Lévi-Strauss says, to novels and to music. Music had always existed with myth. The bard who told the
myth incorporated rhythm, refrain, tone, melody in the telling. Stretches of the narrative gave rise to song, eventually to dance. Modern Europe has seen an extraordinary development of music. The composition of fugues, sonatas, symphonies, performed by ever bigger and more complex orchestras. Compositions by Frescobaldi, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and Wagner. The complex intellectual work of composing a myth with contrasts, oppositions, recurrences, repetitions, reversals, transpositions, and transformations is, Lévi-Strauss says, transformed to large-scale musical compositions. In a myth, this intellectual work was done with verbal phrases, units of meaning that are joined to sounds. In music, it is done with sonorous phrases, units of sounds without meaning. Myth had engendered and depicted community as communion of humans with one another, with the dead, with ancestors, with nature, with totem guardian animals, and with gods. In Wagner's Gesamtkunstwerk, nature resounds in the multiple drones and rumbles, lilts, crescendos, and refrains of the orchestra. And the human voice is woven into the rhythms and melodies of the orchestra as one voice among others in the symphony of the world. In giving oneself over to the symphony, one is depersonalized. One experiences it as Beethoven and as anyone experiences it anywhere centuries later. Individual boundaries dissolve. I remember a performance some 40 years ago of Beethoven's Missa Solemnis in the cathedral in Turku. Turku, the old capital of Finland, was almost completely destroyed by fire in 1827, and the capital moved to Helsinki. Now the cathedral stands alone, far from the rebuilt town, in fields. The music so flooded into me with its soaring grandeur and complexity that there was no part of my mind busy in some corner talking to itself. Since the Missa Solemnis was performed in the cathedral, there was no intermission and no applause. And when it concluded, I and the others walked in silence in the summer night across fields to a bus stop. People did not turn to one another and ask, what did you think of it? We were nowise opaque to one another. We all knew that what we had experienced, everyone walking in that summer night had experienced. Myth and literature. We no longer have anything to do with myth, Jean-Luc Nancy affirms. But he also says, literature, it is true, is the beneficiary or echo of myths. Myth is the origin of literature, and somehow its sole content, its sole narrative, its sole posture. But are there not works of literature and works of cinema that come to function as myths, that lay out, that reveal a world, that name and invoke a people, heroes, gods, powerful animals, mystical landscapes and trees, narratives about which a people come together, become a people? In 1905, Norway became an independent country. It had been part of Denmark and Sweden for 508 years. Cultural life had been centered in Stockholm. In 1917, Knut Hamsun published The Growth of the Soil, a novel of origins with an intense sense of people living in the harsh grandeur of the fjords and forests of the Northland. In 1920, Hamsun received the Nobel Prize. Throughout his life, Hamsun was Norway's most celebrated and widely read author, and his work gave Norwegians a distinctive identity, set in the cliffs and raging watercourses of their North Country. We can also think of Jack Kerouac's On the Road and the film Easy Rider. that revealed and constituted a people called the Beat or Hip generation, not only in the United States, but across the oceans. The novel 100 Years of Solitude is a myth, which Gabriel Garcia Marquez has woven out of legends and folk tales with our author, told and retold in his homeland. Like the myths of pre-modern cultures and those outside the West, it tells of the being together of humans and of gods, demons, other animals, birds, nature, the cosmos, exposed to one another, afflicting one another, sustaining one another, and communicating with one another.
Thank you, Alphonso. Magnificent. One minor question about musicality. I know that every myth is whether spoken or sang or played has different styles. For example, when jazz appeared in the United States, it was thought that it will destroy the whole Western civilization. What are the differences between spoken and sung and played, different styles? What do you think?
I first should say that I hope you recognize that my finger is very limited. You know, I spoke of the first philosophical conception of myths, and I wasn't really talking about the conceptions of myths that then arose in the 20th century from anthropologists who recorded and assembled myths. And also, I spoke especially of a certain modern, originally basically French concept of literature. And then I should get to this question. So Lingis believes that myth is now replaced by, on the one hand, literature and music. So music retains the experience of community as communion.
I tried to invoke the experience that I had so long ago of listening to Beethoven's Mrs. Solemnis, where the sense of individual differences, barriers, boundaries dissolves, and one felt that one was experiencing, everyone was experiencing it, even though it was 150 years since Beethoven composed it. There's music, there always was music with myths. The old bards and storytellers, spoken poetry and rhythm and rhyme and music, what you are calling style. But Lévi-Strauss's idea that this, Lévi-Strauss is so impressed in the intellectual work that goes into composing myths. And so he thinks that that vast intellectual work is now transposed into composition of music. Both the composition of myths and the composition of music worked by contrasts, repetitions, reversals, transformations, and so on. Did I respond at all to anyone?
Some other questions?
No, very.
I'd like to ask, is it possible to speak about the individual myth or personal myth, if it is possible at all, or maybe a myth can be only experienced?
Excuse me, can I come closer to hear you more clearly?
Do you think, is it possible to speak about the individual myth, or personal myth, or myth in its essence is community myth, and can be only experienced personally. So for me, it's interesting. What do you think? What is the relationship between individuality and experiencing the myth and community?
Thank you. That's yeah. That does bring out the limits of what I was doing, because I was really centered on community and on that romantic idea that community, that myths engender a people, a community. So many of us today in the modern world, when we read myths, we really much more read them for personal guidance or vision or insight. And no doubt people always did that way. Certainly the Greeks also were speaking of their own lives, their own personal lives, in the terminology of Zeus and Aphrodite and so on, all their mythic figures. I think what's kind of striking is that neither the Romantics, and certainly not Levi-Strauss, are trying to compose an understanding of that personal effect of relationship with myth. Levi-Strauss completely puts that aside. He wants to just study the structure of a myth, the organization of categories and narratives in myth, and he doesn't at all talk about the personal effect a myth could have. So I especially emphasize the function of myth to create community, a common language, a common terms, but it also works in the reverse. I mean, just take the Christian mythology, for example. It has always engendered heretics. It has always engendered private religions. You know, there are people who take the same common language of the Christian mythology and engender their own personal version of it. So you have I mean, I think this is quite obvious in the world of Christianity, that people pick out some saint, sometimes some eccentric saint, as their personal deity. You know, there's this story, this is from long ago. You probably know, many of you probably know that in Bruges, there is the Chapel of the Holy Blood. So it's flamboyant Gothic chapel, not too big, built over an earlier Romanesque foundation. And it holds the reliquary of the Holy Blood brought back by the Crusades. In other words, the very blood of Jesus. The blood of redemption. And I don't know, I haven't been there for a very long time, but when I was there, the priests spent all day going up and down the altar rail and giving this, offering this reliquary for the people to kiss. You could say it's the most sacred place in Christendom. But when I went downstairs in the old foundation, looking behind the pillars, there were hex signs. There were people who went into this most sacred place to make pacts with the devil. I mean, it's absolutely staggering, you know. I think nowadays nobody believes in Christianity that much to think that you can really make a pact with the devil. But you see, the people who did this, they accepted the whole mythology and created their own private life for it. Is that, I'm talking too much, I think.
Thank you, that was fascinating. I guess my question is related to the last one. You mentioned intellectual construction, connection with myth, and I'm wondering whose intellect is doing the constructing?
Well, for Lingis, it's Ricoeur said it's like the Kantian transcendental ego without an ego. In other words, there is an unconsciousness that constructs according to a whole system of grammatical rules, and that are unconscious just for us. You know, the grammar of our language is unconscious, and the myth. One always says the myth doesn't really have an individual author. Well, one could say it must. I mean, each of these stories at some point must have had an individual author. But as they're told and retold, what was individual about them drops out. And so it becomes a story that every narrator tells. And so it, I could say that the grammar, the vocabulary of myth is a vast and complex system. The reasonings that are involved are unconscious, and the content of the myth is what has been collectively produced in the sense that although it did have an individual storyteller at some point, over time, what was individual in that storyteller has dropped out.
Professor, I'll just walk down a little closer to you. I find it all very fascinating. I'm not a philosopher. Can you hear me? If you come a bit, I'll come to you. I'm not a philosopher. A colleague sent me this invitation and I found it most engaging. Is it too silly a question to consider community and myths of today that will echo with our descendants? I always think of myth as being retrospective. I look back on the myths of the ancients. But how will our descendants, if we ever get there, consider us today?
Yeah, see, it's another place where I was simplifying. So when the Romantics and Nancy declared that myth has come to an end, and that the myth of community has come to an end, I think no. Of course, the Nazi myth was the last great effort, a very powerful effort to recreate community around myth. But I think that this goes on in almost every country, to a lesser extent, not in such a determined and vigorous way that the Nazis employed. But I see that in the United States there's a constant building of a kind of the idea that we are first of all just Americans. So this community in a common Americanness is fundamental, and it's created and recreated by myth. And also, the thing that Nancy is especially sensitive to, this idea that if you die for the community, you live on in the community. That's what he thinks, of course, is not true, because he believes in the definitiveness of individual death. But that idea is very common, I think. I think on every national ceremony, we always think that it is these brave men who died in the war that give our nation its life, its blood. I think that is that continues. And then the other thing, when I mentioned literature that has the function of myth, you know, like Jack Kerouac's On the Road, Easy Rider, which I watched again about a week ago. These really were like myths that created a whole community of people. And I think that continues and will continue. So I think that kind of that specific function of literature that has a mystic effect, I think will continue.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was really inspiring. I was wondering, mostly we're talking about the positive aspects of myth, like, you know, creating the bonds and community. Are there any implicit destructive aspects of myths? Destructive, like setting, you know, the myth becoming a wall, you know, for the community. Well, it's okay for those inside the community, but it's also a wall against the others. So it's like working as a division in a way. Are there any aspects to elaborate? They were sort of implicit in the way we're talking about the Nazis, maybe, but maybe you could say a few words more.
Yeah, I didn't mention that. I think it's very difficult to think about. It seems that every community somehow excludes. That to come together is also functions to exclude. So, I mean, just to have a common language, just to have like the language of English is to make a lot of, to declare a lot of verbiage to be nonsense. So if we all agree to speak English, we all agree on this grammar and so on, we are excluding a lot of verbiage as nonsense. And that's also in a very big dimension true of a myth. It seems that every myth that unites a people excludes people. And
It's a question about whether they are compatible, they usually clash.
yeah. Well, Levi-Strauss is, Levi-Strauss studied over 30 years the myths of North and South of the South American continent. And what he claims to have found is the myths are all in conversation with one another. That a myth that a people develop takes from other myths. I mean, a very simple example is the Jewish Bible, the story of the flood, of Noah and the ark and all that Jewish Bible, that has a version in the Babylonian myths. So biblical scholars have seen, they see that it's a similar story, but the ancient Hebrews changed certain things. And sometimes they reverse things, they reverse the order of things, and so on. Myths just are not ignorant of other myths. And then there are mythical systems, of course, that interpenetrate. I'm thinking of, for example, the Buddhism in Tibet and the earlier Bon religion has so interpenetrated that each of these, you really can't tell who is really Buddhist and who's really Bon, because each of these groups have drawn practices, stories, and so on from the other group. So those are cases where that could occur without hostility. Also, all across Latin America, there's Christian myths brought by the Spanish have not simply displaced the Maya and Aztec myths and so on, but that they have interwoven, intermingled, and that people often do not feel that they're forced to choose one or the other, that one is being excluded by the other. There's a very striking encounter that I had in the city of Chichicastenango in Guatemala, where the Spanish had built a big church, it's as big as this hall, over an old Maya ritual place. And it's a very, very secluded area in the high mountains of Guatemala, very difficult to get to. And a German-American missionary went there to convert these people. And at first he got to know them. And the more he got to know them, the more interested he got in them, and the more friendly he got to them. And so eventually he ended up sort of inviting all the Mayan priests to come to the church and perform at the altar. And little by little they dropped most of the Christian sacraments, retaining only baptism and extreme unction. So that when you go there today, it's really completely extraordinary that in the front steps you can't use those steps because there are sacrifices, sacrificial fires and rituals of all kinds being performed there. You have to go inside. And then inside the church, all on the main altar, there are fires burning with ancient Maya rituals. And at the high altar, there are Mayan priests with all their vestments. So, there are places where the encounter of two very different myths do not produce hostility, but can produce a kind of interweave.
One last question.
Let me get down here better.
Thank you. So, it's very interesting to hear what you have to say. And my question would be, if a myth is kind of an intellectual property, so to say, does the basic concept of the myth does not get diminished by what, as I presume you were saying before, that the myth itself has kind of a schematic, and it can be transcribed in many different forms, as you said, throughout literature, into music, into verbal speech, and so on. So, if it can be transposed and transcribed so many times into so many different forms, I myself would think that it can be done so because of our great minds and because of the discoveries made throughout time towards the newer ages, but does it not become a form of art, just of a schematic of sorts, to build the so-called myth in different form? How does it keep on being a myth? Besides that, the fundamental, expansive story of how existence came into itself, or humanity, or religions and gods, space.
You know, I think now we have the idea of a sacred text that's fixed, and fixed because it's written. And one makes great effort to make sure that we get the right text, the original text. But this is something that's happened to myths that, it's not essential to a myth. In reality, when the myths were told and retold, they were always being creatively developed to the audience and so on. One can think of the Ramayana, the great myth of the Indian subcontinent, which is also which is the main myth of all the dances and literature of Myanmar, for example, a Buddhist country, or Indonesia, which is largely Muslim, and so on. So these myths have always been in flux. They've always been undergoing recreation every generation. I think that's. I think that we should understand that's essential to myth. So you speak of it as that, as art. The creative retelling or restaging of the myth. But I think that art of making it live in completely new ways, generation to generation, belongs to the essence of myth. It's only with the invention of writing that myths got fixed, but that didn't happen outside of the literate part of the world. So in places where there were, in cultures without writing, the myths were always in a state of evolution. Lévi-Strauss insists upon that very much. His method is not to search for the authentic, the original myth in Native American people, but to search for all the versions he could find. And there's something, that you can trace the constant themes of development, like you can trace a theme being developed in work of music. Is that respond to what you had on?
Thank you very much.